Good morning. We're going to talk about telling web ads to shut their pie hole. A little bit about myself. I have my Twitter information, my email information, my blog. I do have the slides available, so I have a link at the very end that will show you where you can get those. So what's my motivation for this? I finally got annoyed with ads. I understand that some sites need ads for revenue. But the tipping point for me, I searched for a pair of shoes and on a particular site. And then for the next 2 weeks, I saw that same pair of shoes on the right-hand side of a whole bunch of other sites that I visited, which I just thought was creepy. I mean, there's a point where I'm okay with you showing me relevant ads on your site, but the amount of sharing between all the people in the background was just too much. I also wanted faster browsing. I wanted better privacy. So I just wanted to stop ads at that point. I know there are browser extensions, but they seem like a lot of work. I have a pretty typical home, like yours, I assume, where I have a lot of different laptops. I've got tablets, I've got gaming systems, I've got phones, and doing browser extensions concern me because the browser extensions have a lot of access to your system, first of all, which from a security perspective made me concerned, but also just some of the devices wouldn't be able to handle that, and I need to install and manage it on every system, which I just didn't want to do. I also had a spare Raspberry Pi, which will come up a bit later. It's one of the deployment options. And just at the time I was looking at it, I also had some trusted recommenders. So Troy Hunt from Have I Been Pwned and Scott Helm, who's a UK security researcher, both had some good articles on how they had used the Pi. I was concerned at first about installing another device. What kind of access would it have? After reading the articles and understanding how it worked, I felt a lot better. I was a little hesitant at first. I haven't done a lot of Raspberry Pi work or things like that. It really didn't take me long to set up, so that's kind of my motivation for where I got started. So what is Pi-hole? So Pi-hole, they call themselves a black hole for internet advertisements. And the idea is you're going to set up a Pi-hole and you can do network-wide blocking of ads. So like I said, I set it up on my router, and every device that attaches to my router then will block ads. It's free. It's open source. So I gave you some links there if you want to contribute or look at how it works or all the various open source projects that go into Pi-hole itself. It was created by Jacob Samela, who is from Minnesota in 2014. He had looked at some other options and they just didn't work out well. And so he decided to create Pi-hole, which is cool. And we'll go out to the site quick. So if you go out there, you can see they do have a lot of good documentation. They walk you through how to install it on various operating systems and details on how that all works. So you can go there. A little teaser for why you'd want to do this. So I previously was using Cloudflare's DNS service, and I'll talk about the reasons why for privacy, security, etc. But I hit CNN's website and I used Fiddler, which is a tracing tool between the browser and the server, which I'll show you in a bit. But I went to CNN's homepage and you'll see it made 514 requests. And it talked to 166 different hosts on the internet, and it was about 4.3 meg. With the Pi-hole in place, we cut it down to only 97 requests. So 81% less requests were made, down to 24 hosts. So 86% less hosts were talked to. So that's a huge deal. I just want to see the news. I don't need you talking to 142 other hosts passing who knows what about me to them. And the size of the page was about 50% smaller. So I did the same thing on USA Today. And you can see we've got similar reductions, 88% less requests, 87% less hosts. So when you talk about performance, 70% smaller, it's a lot faster to download. It's better privacy. You're not sharing data with 222 other hosts that are involved. I'm not sure why. And all the content looked the same to me. Pi-hole does come with a dashboard. Just to give you an idea, this was 24 hours of my home network. I had about 13,000 DNS queries, and about 42% of those were blocked. We'll talk about how that works here in a minute. So the foundation of this is DNS, the domain name system for the internet. And what it does is it translates domain names into IP addresses. So I take www.example.com. When I run that through a DNS, I get the IP address here on the right. And that's what the internet, the browsers, all the actual traffic is using the IP address. So this system takes the domain name and gets the right IP address to contact. There are a lot of public DNS servers, so typically when you hook up to your ISP, you get assigned a DNS. It could be their own DNS, it could be someone else. I've always liked public DNS servers for a number of reasons. If you make wise choices, they have better privacy, better performance, they're more reliable, they can be more secure. There are some that do filtering. So I have used Cloudflare for a long time. So I started on 1.1.1.1. That was my DNS service years ago. And I liked it because they don't sell your data. Some of the ISPs will sell what hosts you're visiting, and that's not something I need people to share. So I was using 1.1.1.1. They actually came out with some additional add-ons to that, where if I use this one, it blocks malware. So they have a list of malware sites on Cloudflare. If I use this for my DNS, it will stop those from resolving. Then they came out with malware and adult content. So today I use 1.1.1.3 as my upstream DNS provider, which we'll talk about. You can also use DNS that block ads. So similar to Pi-hole, I've used AdGuard DNS. You can go look them up. It's a free service. You can set up to use them for your DNS. Worked just fine. I did measurements just like I did for Pi-hole. The main thing is I can't override it myself. So I like using Pi-hole better because I can set up particular sites I want to allow or not allow, and I just have more control and I have a better dashboard to understand what's happening. But those are options for you as well. So again, that's what DNS is. So how does Pi-hole work? So you install and configure Pi-hole, and then really what Pi-hole is to me, it's a configurable list of domains that host, in this case, ads. I can also find other lists. So there are public lists of malware or adult content. Pi-hole, think of it as just, it's a list of domains you don't want to go to. And what Pi-hole will do is it will act as a local DNS server. So I set up my router to use my Pi-hole for DNS. So when you go to www.example.com, it will go to Pi-hole. Pi-hole will look up its lists and say, is this a domain we don't want you to go to? If it doesn't want you to go there, it will actually give back an invalid IP address. It'll essentially say, this host isn't known, which is nice because it effectively blocks the ads. There's no requests that actually happen because there's no IP address to contact, so it's faster. There are other ways to do the blocking mode, but that's the one that I'm using. So I talked about Fiddler. Again, I think a lot of you have probably seen it, but it's a free tracing tool to watch web traffic. So I created a web page, test.htm, and I purposely referenced some host names that I knew served ads. And if I click on one of these, you'll see when my browser tried to resolve this domain name, it got back a 502, and you can see Fiddler says DNS lookup failed. So that's what I want. If it's in Pi-hole and it's being blocked because of ads or my configuration, whichever, it'll get back an invalid IP address and there'll be no conversation with that host. So one of the more popular ways to use Pi-hole is using a Raspberry Pi. So I gave you a link here to where you can find out more about it. But basically, Raspberry Pi, their whole mission is they wanted to get small and affordable computers available for people around the world. So computers were too expensive. You can see there are various types of Raspberry Pis. I gave you links to the two that I have used down here below. The very low end, the Pi Zero. I gave you a link here. I just happen to point to Amazon. You can get it wherever you want. You can put it together yourself from parts. I just bought a kit. I didn't want to assemble everything. It cost about $39, and that's able to run Raspberry Pi for me. Right now I'm running it on a Pi 3 for about $80, and the Pi 4s are out. So again, they're very cheap Linux variant-based computers. So I choose to run Raspbian OS, which is the official operating system from Raspberry Pi. So basically I bought these two kits. There's some good setup instructions. So if we go out to Raspberry Pi, they have a setup, so I can go down to the downloads and I can walk through on Windows, getting an imager. It's not very complicated. So I downloaded software. I got an SD card that is going to be inserted into the Pi. It comes with the kit if you buy one of the kits that you had. And I can basically take the Raspbian OS and I can get it onto that card, pop the card out, put it into the Raspberry Pi, boot it, and now I have a running Raspberry Pi. When I do this, I run it headless as well. So it's connected to my network, in my case via Wi-Fi, and then I can use VNC, which is free software that lets me remotely connect into the Raspberry Pi. So I can act like I'm sitting there without needing the monitor, the keyboard, and everything else. So that's how I have it set up. Again, it's just a cheap computer. I get it set up with the OS. The next step I'll do is I'll run the Pi-hole install. So I go to a terminal on the Raspberry Pi and I run this command. And all this is saying is it uses curl, which makes HTTP requests. It goes out to this script that's online that runs the Pi-hole and it pipes it into a bash script. So that line, if I run it at Raspberry Pi terminal, will go through the install process. So there's a series of screens that'll go through at the it asks me which interface, am I using Wi-Fi? It asks me here who I want to use for upstream DNS. So Pi-hole is, I think of it as an intermediary proxy. It's just going to get the initial DNS request, look up if it should reject it or not. If it rejects it, it's done. If not, it wants to pass the request to a real DNS provider. So this is the case where I told you I use Cloudflare 1.1.1.3. So once I set this up, I'm blocking web ads. I'm also blocking, because of Cloudflare's service, I'm blocking known malware, and I'm also blocking adult content on my site. It asks me for the lists I want to use. So by default, it's configured with Pi-hole's install. There's 2 public lists of ad serving sites. So I just use those. Pi-hole is set up to auto-update that. So periodically, it will go check the list for new sites and add that in. You don't have to do anything to have that happen. I will warn you, the very last step of the install, it will show you your password for the Pi-hole. So in Pi-hole, I install it so it has a web interface, so I can remotely look at a dashboard, which I'll show you. So on the very last screen, it creates a default password. If you missed that or you want to change it, you can just go to a terminal on the Pi again and run sudo Pi-hole a-p and your new password. So now I've got Raspberry Pi set up, I've got it on my network, I've got Pi-hole installed and configured. So now I want to set up my network to use a Pi-hole. So the first couple days or week that I did this, I did device-specific DNS config. In other words, I use Windows 10. I went into my network Wi-Fi settings and I can manually override. I just set my DNS to be the IP address of my local Pi-hole on my network. I did that on my own machine for a while. I beta tested it before I got family feedback. In other words, I have other people in the house that depend on internet connections. When I first got this, I didn't want to just install it and have people have issues. So I ran it for a few weeks, everything went fine. Then I actually go into my router. So you go into your router config, and there should be a place where you can set a manual DNS server. So I just go into that DNS entry and I put the IP address of my Pi-hole. One warning I'll give you, I have a single Pi-hole on a single IP address, and I thought, well, if that failed, I wanted to use a secondary DNS like my Cloudflare. Unfortunately, the way Windows 10 at least works, it gets both of these DNS names and it uses them both. It's not a failover of the first one goes to second, it just round robins. So I noticed that when I did that, that about half the time I saw ads and half the time I didn't. So I'm actually set up now where I have a single entry for DNS that points to my Pi-hole. It is a single point of failure. So if we suddenly started seeing can't resolve a domain name, I know I might have a problem with my Pi-hole. I can go switch it at that point back to Cloudflare, or I can fix whatever's wrong and restart it. And then I've taught other family members, how do you override if they don't want to use Pi-hole or they're having a site that has an issue. They know how to go in and manually set their DNS entries on their devices to be able to skip Pi-hole if they needed to. There's a dashboard. So I showed you some of the things you saw before, the block percentages. It does show me the top permitted domains, the top blocked domains. There is a way to allow and disallow specific domains. So we've had, in the couple years I've used Pi-hole, we've had a couple websites that didn't work, like they wouldn't function because a particular host they needed was blocked by Pi-hole. I could actually take that host name and put it into an allow list in the web interface and say, I know it's on your list to block, but I need to have that in there. So that's fixed those problems. I could also just say, I know there's a site I don't want family members to go to, and I can put in that specific host in the website and it'll block that. You can also disable Pi-hole temporarily. So there are websites that notice you have ad blocking set up, and they will come up and say you're using an ad blocker and we won't let you use our content in that case. You can either specifically allow them through Pi-hole and you'll see ads, or in my case, I think I was on my Xbox trying to watch NCAA finals and I got that block. I didn't want to deal with that at the time, so I just went into the web interface and turned Pi-hole off temporarily. So you could disable it for a number of minutes or hours or until you turn it back on. So that got me through where I could watch everything on my Xbox because that particular site was blocking me and everything went well. And there's lots of other settings you can tweak in there as well. Once you have all this set up, I just want to tell you there are some things that you should know about. So DNS by itself is the traffic between your client and the DNS server on the internet is not encrypted. So it can be inspected or it could be poisoned. So for instance, if I went to Amazon.com, Pi-hole will allow that. I'm using Cloudflare. My conversation between my DNS and Cloudflare, if I had someone in the middle intercepting traffic, they could actually say, Amazon's not at that IP address, it's at this one. And they could point it at a phishing site. There's a way to get around that. There are new ways to encrypt DNS. If you look at Scott Helm, he has an article on how you can set up Pi-hole to use Cloudflare's DNS over HTTPS if you're concerned about that. Some of the vendors are getting smarter, and they are basically not using host names anymore to serve their ads. They use IP addresses. So if you think about what Pi-hole does, it's sitting over on my network. It's not like a firewall where everything's going through it. All it's doing is resolving DNS names. If these sites use IP addresses instead of DNS names, my Pi-hole won't block those ads. There's also devices and software that ignore your DNS settings. So whatever I have configured on my Windows machine, some software and devices hard code their own DNS. If they do that, I won't be able to block anything that they're serving because they're not using my Pi-hole as DNS. There will certainly be domains that are not lists in the lists configured for Pi-hole. So new domains come up every day. It takes a while for those to get added to the list, and it takes a while for my Pi-hole to pick them up. So just be aware that can happen. And also if you're not getting list updates, so Pi-hole is set up to automatically update, but if for some reason that wasn't working, new sites wouldn't be blocked. So just be aware of these things. Some other miscellaneous things, make sure your Raspberry Pi gets operating system updates just like everything else. There are security issues. So in this case with Raspbian OS, these are the 3 commands I run. So I just use VNC, get a terminal over to my Pi, and I run those commands every month or so just to make sure my Pi OS itself is up to date. You can also run Pi-hole updates. So on the same terminal, you can see I can run this and it will update if there's any Pi-hole updates. The dashboard also shows you at the bottom. It'll show you if there are updates. So let me pop over to, I have a public facing one here. And if I were to go at the bottom, it shows me whether I'm up to date. So right now I happen to be up to date. If not, these will glow and say there's an update available for Pi-hole, so I can go run that. There are other ways to do this besides using a Raspberry Pi. So I've set up a Linux virtual machine in Azure, and I actually run Pi-hole on that. Generally, the Pi-hole people say don't do that on public IP addresses and leave them running. There's some security issues related to that. I just leave it out there for when I travel. I shut it off. When I go to travel, I can spin it up so I can point my laptop at my Pi-hole in the cloud, so I still get blocking, because it's amazing when you're used to blocking at home and you start to travel and you see ads again, you just cry. So the other option is Docker containers. So Pi-hole does have a Docker container pre-built and set up. So I actually got Docker for Windows, took out an old laptop of mine, installed Docker for Windows, went and got the Docker container for Pi-hole. It was basically all set up and running at that point. I pointed my router to that, I was good to go. Another option is Pi-hole via a VPN. So I haven't used this yet, but again, if you're traveling, it gives you a way to VPN back into your Pi-hole at home, so you still get ad blocking if you're interested in that. Pi-hole is free. How can we help then? Pi-hole, we could make open source contributions. If you're into that, you can donate. Just give a straight up amount of money. If you say, hey, I like your product, here's something to help out. You could become a patron. So you can actually set up to say monthly, I'll give money to Pi-hole so they can do development. They have affiliate links. I've chosen to become an advocate for it. Again, love the product. I don't get anything for it. I use it at home all the time, so I like to tell people about it to improve their browsing. Some quick resources: the Pi-hole documentation, the Pi-hole site, the Raspberry Pi site. This is the Twitter for Pi-hole itself. And again, if you have any questions, that is my Twitter, that is my email and blog, and that is a link to the slides. So with that, that's all that I had. And again, increase your security, your performance, and your privacy setting up a Pi-hole. It's easy to do. It didn't take me long, and your surfing will be better for it. So thanks.